Video games grabbed me, and they never let me go. I've loved games ever since I first played LEGO Star Wars at my friend's house in 2005. There was nothing else near as engaging as a video game. The idea to make my own game first occurred to me when I was 10 years old. I wanted to take these things that I loved so much and make them my own. I begged and pleaded with my parents to let me take classes teaching game design, and eventually they got me a tutorial book, downloaded an engine for me, and set me on my way. So, originally this part of the video was going to contain a few clips of the original project that I worked on, since it was all public stuff that you could download online and use for free. However, I could not find that anywhere. I've scoured the web, and it doesn't seem to exist anymore, and I'm not going to pay $1,008 to get the book again. So, instead of those clips, please enjoy this short montage of Barack Obama's ankles. You're welcome. I was about 2 hours into my first project, following along with the tutorial to make an asteroid-type game, when something broke. I had changed something, and all of a sudden what I had built stopped working altogether, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it, so I quit, and I never picked up that book again. Fast forward a bit, and I was messing around with command blocks in Minecraft, building custom adventure maps. I'd watch tutorials on YouTube about how to use the different commands, and start these huge grand adventure stories filled with cities, puzzles, and deep characters, not one of which I ever finished because I always scoped way too large. I made some cool stuff in these worlds, but because of my huge goals, I never really got anywhere and would always just end up immortalized and delete the world. I really wish I could still walk around these builds and see all the cool stuff I did. Fast forward a bit more, and then I heard about Unity, a totally free game engine with a huge supportive community, great for beginners to make their first game. Downloaded it, installed it, opened it, and holy frickin' heck. It was way too complicated and overwhelming for me, and it's been sitting on my taskbar for over a year now, watching me, judging me. And with my recent need to, I don't know, do something vaguely productive with my life, I figured maybe it's time to learn to make computers do the things for me. So once again, I decided to open up Unity, and I had that same overwhelming feeling and anxiety.
Recently, the folks at Unity asked us to do a series on creating your first game.
Luckily, making 2D games in Unity has gotten so much easier over the last couple of years.
Jumping is one of the most important parts of any platformer game.
So before we get started, my name is John Spacecraft. I've been making games for over 10 years now.
But thanks to several dozen YouTube tutorials and Unity's free learning resources, I was able to put together this. Okay, this isn't particularly impressive, I know, but it took me a lot to get here, and I'm pretty proud of what I've done. So this being my first real game, and since I actually wanted to finish something for once, I knew I needed to keep this one small. No grand story, no crazy artwork, no complex systems, just a generic bare-bones game to learn the basics. I decided to take inspiration from a Flash game I played as a kid called Snailiad, a simple platformer shooter where the main mechanics are just jumping, wall crawling, and shooting. There's a few enemy types and a few bosses. It seemed fairly simple to put together. So I started off by making a list of things that I needed in the game and features that I'd like to be in the game. I needed basic art, to walk, to jump, to wall crawl. I needed obstacles, an enemy, a weapon, a boss, a health system, a start screen, a pause screen, and an end screen. At the time, that's what I decided was the minimum I needed to accomplish before I would consider the game finished. But being a serial victim of scope creep and always having a desire to shoot myself in the foot, I dreamt up a long list of things that I thought would make this an actual good game. Better art, directional flip animation, movement animation, a shield shell, more enemy types, more levels, more bosses, multiple weapons, a snail village, a dialogue system, and an overarching story to tie it all together. Thankfully, in the end, I ended up cutting most of this stuff to keep the development short and simple for my novice skill level. Next, I got to work on some super simple placeholder art in Photoshop. I don't really know if I can call this placeholder art because I never got around to changing most of it. Even the freaking grass corner that's 1 pixel off, damn my laziness. However, given the general noviceness the entirety of the game ended up having, I'm just gonna dub this whole thing a placeholder. Who knows, maybe I'll come back to it in a year or two. I then used Unity's Tilemap system to build a small test area and coded a super simple movement script, which definitely worked on the first try. At first I thought this was a problem with my player movement script, and I proceeded to rewrite it twice. It didn't fix it, but after some experimentation, literally just moving the player out of the tile map, I figured out it was actually due to the box colliders. For anyone who doesn't know, box colliders basically just tell Unity that whatever you apply the box collider to is a solid object, so no other box colliders can pass through it. Every solid object needs one. The problem here was I foolishly assumed that the tile map box collider would only be set to the individual tiles that I placed and not the empty space inside of it. Instead, the box collider was set to cover the entire tile map, corner to corner and everything in between, which meant that when we placed our snail dude, he needs a proper name. What's a good name for a snail? Jerry. So when we placed Jerry inside the level, we were basically putting him inside a solid object. So when we started the game, the physics engine didn't really know what to do with it and just kinda excreted him out. I then discovered that you can add multiple colliders to the same object and added them to each side of my map. This didn't seem like a particularly good solution, probably because it wasn't, and later in development I discovered the Tilemap Collider component, which adds a collider to every individual tile. Turns out there's a ton of different collider types, and I really wish I would have known this when I started. So now I could actually move around the map, but not well. Jerry is super slippery, he starts out slow and slides to an uncontrollable stop. He can also jump indefinitely, glide if you hold the jump button, and he's super spinny. There was also this bug where you could stick onto walls if you're holding the button down while against a wall. First I tried to fix the slidiness. I was making Jerry move by detecting when the A or D keys were pressed and setting his velocity to either positive or negative on the x-axis. Negative to go left and positive to go right. I thought I could fix the sliding by setting the velocity back to 0 when either the A or D button were released, and this worked really well, but only half the time. I still don't understand why it didn't always work. And what do you do when something doesn't work? You get a bigger hammer, of course. I thought since it wasn't always working when I set it to 0, maybe it needed to have a negative force when stopping to help counter its momentum. This still worked only half the time, but even when it did work, it was just terrible. So for the third time, I scrapped my movement script and rewrote it, this time using add force instead of setting the velocity, which fixed nothing and only made Jerry the speediest snail alive due to the compounding effect of adding speed every frame the key is held down instead of setting it to a fixed value. So I went back to the tutorial and found a really simple solution that was basically just a better implementation of my first. Instead of setting the velocity to 0 when either A or D is released, I needed to add an else statement saying that when neither A or D is being pressed, the velocity is 0, which is basically the same thing as the first thing I tried, but this one works, so I'm not gonna question it and just move on. I then made Jerry flip around when you switch directions, which definitely didn't take me 2.5 hours to figure out. After that, I got back to the movement and added a raycast to see if the player was on the ground or not, successfully nerfing Jerry's god tier jump. I also found a tutorial showing me how to program a better jump, similar to Mario's. This made Jerry feel much better to control. I also used what I learned with the ground check raycast to make a wall check to eliminate sticking to walls. If the raycast detects a wall, the velocity is automatically set to 0, so you can't keep applying force to the wall and stick to it. This probably isn't the best way to fix the bug, but it worked for me. And this is the point where I started to look into the wall walking. After researching it for a good 2 hours, I decided that rather than torture myself, it would probably be best to set this idea aside for when I'm more experienced. I then made a slight improvement to Jerry's sprite and added a fancy movement animation. I also followed a tutorial to make the camera follow the player, which works well, but when you're jumping to the side and the camera's following you, it jitters like crazy and just looks terrible. But I can't figure out how to fix it, so I'm just gonna leave it for now. Next came health and obstacles, and honestly, I think the health system that I made in this game is the only thing that I'm properly proud of, and I think it's actually pretty good. You see, generally I think games rely way too much on HUDs and UIs. Any chance I get to take that crap away and see more of the game is a win in my book. So I came up with the idea that when Jerry takes damage, instead of a health bar being lowered, his shell will crack a bit, and when he takes enough damage, it'll break and he'll die on the next hit, and the level will be reset. This took forever to figure out how to implement and really confused me on how to properly reference other scripts, but I'm super happy with how it turned out. I then made this little guy, let's call him Turt, and then I made a simple patrol script, so he'd walk from one edge of the platform, turn around and walk to the other, and repeat for eternity. And of course, it worked perfectly.
Fuck this shit, I'm out.
But ultimately, the patrol script I had written was way more complicated than it needed to be. I ended up removing a few if statements and the bool, and literally just changed equals to a plus equals, and it worked perfectly. The only problem is when the player enters Turt's Collider, it hurts them, but only upon entry. They can stay there as long as they want, and as long as they never leave the Collider again, they'll never get hurt again. And as cool as chilling with Turt would be, this isn't quite what I want, and it's also a problem with the spikes. So I decided to try and figure out how to add invincibility frames for the player. So after what seemed like ages, I finally figured out how to turn off player collision, and my invulnerability worked perfectly. Except for when you respawn, then you wouldn't take any damage at all. thought that restarting the scene would set everything back to how it was, basically the same thing as pressing the play button in Unity, but I figured I'd better make sure. My only guess as to what was causing the issue was that after the scene ended, the script didn't have any time to set the layer collision back to true, and thus it wasn't colliding with any of the obstacles. So I added the line of code that re-enables those layers to be called when the scene starts. And much to my relief, it worked. Jerry can now die for eternity. This is when I started to mess around with the shooting mechanics, and after about 6 hours of watching tutorials and failing to implement them in a half-decent way, I again decided to set this idea aside and just keep the game as a super simple, tiny platformer. And honestly, this was a really hard call to make. The shooting mechanic was originally one of my needs. It was kind of what the game was based around, but I knew it was the right call to make because this was my first game and I just needed to get it done and not get bogged down in the stupid little things that would make me want to quit and not finish it. I'm a lot more concerned about getting this game finished and out there rather than having it be good. So as far as coding goes, I was basically done at this point. All I had left to make this an actual game was to make a level. I decided that since the scope of this game is so tiny and I wanted to finish it up pretty quick and move on, that I'd just make it a one-level game. I divided the level into 3 difficulty tiers. The second tier honestly is harder, but the third is longer, so it kinda evens out. And I added little ditches underneath the stages in case you fall off to take you back to the start of each tier. I made a small pit near the beginning to hopefully teach players that they don't need to go exploring down the pits, but if I were ever to come back to this, I'd replace them with one-way platforms. Overall, falling into the ditches is really boring because it's just backtracking to the start, and in the future I'll have to work out an actual solution, but for now this works. I decided to completely skip sound effects and music to keep it extra simple. I then made a start screen and a pause screen, which wasn't hard, it just took me forever, and then the win screen. Yeah, I don't really know what the heck happened here. So I made a trigger and put it at the end, so when the player got to the end and entered the trigger area, a menu similar to the pause menu would come up, with an option to go back to the main menu and quit. I placed Jerry right near the end so I didn't have to play all the way through the entire level to test it, and it worked. The game was done. So I built it and went in for one final playtest. Everything worked fine except the win menu. It wouldn't come up. I went back into Unity and played through it again, and it still wouldn't work. So I put Jerry back near the end and tested it again. No problem, it worked just fine. Maybe taking damage messes something up? Nope. Maybe starting far away? If I drag Jerry to the end in the editor, it works just fine. Maybe it's something to do with time? Nope, I can wait all day and it doesn't change anything. I've tried everything I can think of. The only way I can't get it to trigger is if I play through from the beginning in a normal way. For the life of me, I cannot figure this out, and the internet so far hasn't had any solutions, and so at this point, I'm just ready to be done with this and move on to a new project, so... And now the game is done. Done enough. There's still the super annoying camera jitter, the super basic art that kinda just looks grayish and gross, the fact that it's only one super simple level, and it doesn't have any sound at all. There's a lot more I could do with this game. Heck, the game that inspired me to make this game has a ton more going on in it, shooting bosses, multiple weapons, and while I can always come back later and add more to this if I want, for now I think I've gotten this stupid little game far enough, and I'm ready to move on. I've learned a lot. I think the most valuable thing I learned is to not waste my time trying to figure out something myself. One of the extra credit videos that I watched told me this exact thing, but I thought if I could figure out how to scrape things together with as little knowledge as possible, that it would help me learn. And while this might be true, the time I wasted trying to figure it out myself, when I know practically nothing and the internet already has a great solution, it's just not worth it. Messing around and experimenting is good, but wasting hours doing something you don't know how to do is just a waste. So yeah, that was the development of my first game, Turtle Jumper. Nothing impressive, but an important step to help me learn. I was frustrated, overwhelmed, and endlessly annoyed, but those moments when you finally make something work or create a good health system make it all worth it. I'll definitely be coming back to Unity soon. And if for some reason you want to play Turtle Jumper, it's available for free on itch.io. It really isn't a must-play by any means, but I figured, why not? Thanks for watching. I hope to make more videos in this devlogish style in the future. I'm not planning on replacing the topical video discussions by any means, so I'll have to find a balance. But that's all I've got for this one right now, so I'll see you all in the next one.